So here's the topic that I want to talk about today. It seems very general. It's basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about based on my own personal experiences, and also just I've been in China working on heritage conservation and management and development projects since 2008. So I think the scene, the profession itself has changed a lot. China has changed a lot in general. So I'm really going to go through some of the ideas of what I have seen, especially case studies that some of you might be familiar with on reflecting those changes and trend in China. And I particularly want to talk about the issue of interpretation and uses of heritage, because I think there is something that we are really trying to depart from, where we're only concerned with the conservation of historic fabric. And when we talk about interpretation, you have to think about a variety of issues. You have to think about a variety of users, and a lot of them may or may not be interested in heritage, who may or may not be relevant in the professional field in that sense, but then yet they are going to be the one who's actively engaged in it, and they are the one who we are trying to engage in it. And I do think that also being here at Kwun, which is also, I think, for me, from my limited knowledge of it, is an institution that's very much concerned and focused on engaging the public with the heritage of what it means. So this is what I hope I can share some experiences here today. So indulge with me where I asked this very stupid question of what's interpretation of heritage. Many of you are already professional. You don't really need me to tell you what it means. Just for this purpose, because I want to talk about how this is kind of, at least those of us in the field, when we talk about heritage interpretation, so we all have read Tilden and his 6 rules of interpretation, and it's kind of our textbook on how we define what it means, and also obviously with the irony of, not irony, but it's obvious why Tilden, who is not a conservator, who is not coming from a conservation background, actually was advocating and thinking about how do we actually translate all this information and knowledge that we have to, people who may or may not be part of this profession and understand that. So this is kind of the standard idea of interpretation that we all have and we are all being trained. And then what I wanted to also talk about is, things have really evolved over the years, where we used to think about this conventionally. Heritage, obviously, is we talk about design, display, we talk about museum, we talk about interpretation, we talk about guide and interpreter, and all these things are still very much what we use. We have obviously moved on a very strange world now where we talk about digitization and AI and the whole debate of how important is it for you to actually be in close distance with the physical fabric or even a physical space. I'm not going to go into that today because all my case studies and the point I want to share is really still very site-oriented. It's all about how do you actually talk about doing interpretation in situ. But I just want to talk about how also in terms of the medium and methods, we have really departed from this is what we're training, and then there's a lot of possibility right now. But then really what I'm really interested in talking about is also the evolving definition of how we have moved on from the Tilden kind of explanation and definition, where obviously interpretation is educational activity. It is how we communicate certain facts and information or things that, we try to, we might be too technical or too boring even, where we try to engage people. But then also it's really moving from beyond that into a participatory interaction. So also, does the user also contribute towards the interpretation or the understanding on the presentation of your heritage value? So I think that is something that is very much in debate right now in the field. And then also coming from a WeChat UNESCO affiliate background, and with Richard here tonight, we all like to talk about outstanding universal value as defined by World Heritage Site. But we are also always now challenging in many cases, well, is that kind of the Bible of that? What does diverse heritage value is? Who defines these very diverse heritage value? Do you have to be well trained in the menu of defining the 6 criteria for World Heritage in order to do that? So really, it's what we're talking about. And then also, I think this is one of the most interesting things for me is because when we are defined by professionals, including myself, which I try to critique myself in that sense. We think about heritage value or the absolute sacredness almost. Well, this is a historic site. It has this thousands of years of history. So, we definitely have to hold it with such, we're in awe of it, and we all have to preserve towards this value. But then there's also a lot of more complex and diverse value of users who might be engaged in a heritage site, but maybe not from a historical or even heritage relevant component, but they are also relevant as stakeholder as we see that now. So how are they part of this process? So it's just to really talk about it. So borrowing from Laura Jane Smith, which a lot of people might know in the field, is really talking about the idea of heritage. Now it has really moved on as an act of communication and meaning making, and who makes this meaning? And then this idea of evolving different definition of what we talk about interpretation, and then put it in the context of China, which we know has a very, very particular specific context. We have a discussion earlier with Anita about talking about it's a place, a country with such strong emphasis on having unified narrative about what it means and to be what is the correct narrative. So what does all this mean now in China when we look at the different forms of interpretation? So in the China context, in fact, when we talk about interpretation, why I do use interpretation and use, right now, for those of you who might be familiar, we almost never talk about, usually I will use 阐释 or 解说 for interpretation, but in China, with the term we always use 展示利用, so use and presentation interpretation are always being talked about together. We will think of them as two different terms, but then they represent the same thing as we talk about interpretation now in China. And that did not come from me. That actually comes from official documents. So especially the term 展示利用 this is the official definition that I extracted this from the China Principle. The new China Principle, revised edition in 2015, there's a large chapter covered on what it means to interpret and to use a heritage site. So I'm not going to the definition here, as everybody can read, or you can read from the document. But I do want to talk about, for those of you who might have read the old version of the China Principle, which is released in 2004, there was no mention of interpretation or presentation in that version, or very little. And then one of the big change is how it talks about, what I find interesting is really talking about how can this foster involvement in conservation. So it's not just about me conveying certain kind of facts and to educate you about the heritage value, but also how do you make people care about preserving the place, about conserving the place. And this is what I think is interesting, that it has really evolved in that sense. And then also words like society, relationship, all those are words that you will not see in the old version. When we talk about interpretation of site, it's all about historical value, how many thousands of years of history has happened here. The next thing, the most important thing, why we talk about interpretation use, 展示利用, is appropriate use, which is 合理利用. And 合理利用 is an official legal term that is actually in 2016, the National Cultural Heritage Administration released a document on how do we promote the appropriate use, 合理利用, of cultural relics in China. So again, I'm not going to go into the definition, but then, we start seeing words that we've never seen before in heritage in China on sustainable, community well-being, all these things that while we understand them as principle in the profession, but then these are coming from kind of authoritative, documents that really stress all this understanding. Another thing, which is we're all familiar with, is adaptive reuse. So again, appropriate use is different from adaptive reuse in this sense. So adaptive reuse is really just kind of in a normal sense, as in Taiko now, this is adaptive reuse. We're talking about adapting the physical space. But appropriate use is kind of a more blanket terms of what use can mean. It could be, physical transformation of the function of the site, or it could be just how people, decide to use the site, or it could be really how how you understand and interpret the value or the understanding of the significance of the site. But what I want to talk about this is because for some of you who might be familiar, I said this is China Principle in 2015. The 合理利用 appropriate use document was issued in 2016. But for some of you who might know, before that, there's this very famous controversial case study of the TRB, the Temple Restaurant Bar in Beijing, which is originally part of two temples, Zhizhu and then Songzhu. And then there's this, even the New York Times, this is actually, I found a backdated article in New York Times on 2014, where it got into a very controversial case of, well, this is a Ming Dynasty, and then also a city, provincial, municipality level protected site. And then there were two parts of the temple, so that one is converted into a high-end Western restaurant, for those of you who might have been there. The other part was actually converted into a private Chinese restaurant, but not so much restaurant, like private clubhouse that's catered to very exclusive clientele. And then, so there was this huge debate that criticism from the state news agency, Xinhua, who really talk about how this is really inappropriate use and this commercialization and how it's breaking a lot of regulation. So I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but it was, in fact, I was even invited to kind of an open discussion at the temple bar with a group of professionals and talking to the owner, and we're really trying to discuss this issue. And one of the big controversial is also because the owner of the restaurant, I think it coming that he's not Chinese. He's actually from Belgian origin. So there's also a question of a foreigner coming into a protected site, historic site, and changing it into something else. And I think that generated some uncomfortable feeling among some people. But then again, I see this article is from 2014, and then right after that, appropriate use. We talk about interpretation and use. These become an official doctrine. So now nobody criticizes this anymore. In fact, there's all kinds of innovative way of talking about it. So this is just an example of how quickly things can change and turn in China, both in practice, but also in terms of the media and also in the official attitude of the management or the system. There's a lot of that happening in China. I don't have to talk about it. I'm sure all of you knows. And Shanghai is actually way kind of beyond most other cities in China on kind of modern architecture preservation. So they have their own, a lot of cities also have it now, but they're one of the first city to have this 近现代优秀建筑. So, kind of they have their own system of grading what is an outstanding modern architecture, which is released by the Shanghai city, whereas most other places like in Beijing, we still don't have something like that. And I want to talk about this particular example, which is Columbia Circle, which I don't know if any of you have been. It's not as well known as a lot of other projects in Shanghai. So this is built by, back in the days, as a country club and also part of a marine club for the American Marines. And then so it was kind of set in the kind of a rural suburb area of Shanghai back then, and then where the expats kind of built this community there to serve as their country club. And then it was designed by a Slavic Hungarian architect, Udak, which I think his name is Udak. And then it has gone through different period where also eventually when the last, now it's kind of, as we're seeing anywhere else, which is, it has kind of like Tycoon, it has cultural event, it has commercial activities, it has, it's kind of a creative hub with commercial and cultural appeals to people. But what's interesting before that, the last takeover was actually from a pharmaceutical company in Shanghai, and which is why the Chinese name Shangsheng Xinsuo, because that was actually the pharmaceutical name for it. And then now it has been kind of real estate development by Wanke, which has done a lot of this kind of urban regeneration projects. So this is Shangsheng Xinsuo, which is the pharmaceutical company. So you see you can have, this is a mixed development where you have this more, this is Wudake's old mansion, and then it was later turned to the mansion of Sun Ke, which is a grandchild of Sun Yat-sen. And then so you have these more stylistic colonial buildings, but you also have building from the 80s that was used by a pharmaceutical company. You have the Tsutaya bookstore, which is a very fancy bookstore from Japan. This is the Marine Club. Right now, the Marine Club is full of commercial fancy restaurants, and also a main space is actually used for a lot of events like fashion show. And the reason why I want to talk about this particular project, not because obviously it's nicely done, it's nicely restored, but that's not what my focus is. What's interesting is because I've been working very closely with this fashion company in China related to my project, working with women in Guizhou doing textile. And then this fashion company, their mission is they want to talk about social and eco-responsibility. That's what they brand themselves as, different from all the other kind of quick fashion company. And then so their model is very interesting, where they have a parent company, and then they will actually cultivate many different independent designer and brand under the mother company, and a lot of them has independent ideas. So some of them that we're working with, they actually work with ethnic minority women doing hand-weave fabric in Yunnan and in Guizhou and different places. One of them is actually independent Tibetan designer, where they develop products that's made by contemporary young Tibetan designers, and then they have another one that is really working on kind of an eco coffee concept from Yunnan. I'm just giving you an example of the diverse range. So what they have dedicated is they have chosen a place like Columbia Circle, where they decided to use a place-making approach, where they put all their different stores with this kind of very social and culture-conscious brand and mission here, and they try to build a community here. So they try to have their fashion show here, they try to have their release, they try to do workshop, they try to do different things to cultivate a community who will use this physical space where people can really understand the mission statement that they're trying to convey in their brand. So without really talking about, well, this is the heritage side, this is the heritage value of Columbia Circle, and we have all this and this history, they're really making a statement by saying we are putting our ground here, we're putting all our different brand here, and we're trying to use this approach where to tie ourselves to a site with rich culture and history, and by converting it, by doing responsible design, adaptive reuse, this is where our statement stands as a company. So I want to talk about this because I also like to talk about the value, why it may not be directly interpretive in terms of history and culture. It can be defined, the use and the value of this place can be defined by the current user who might not have this very apparent relationship with the history of the site, but you can understand why they choose to be here, why they choose to be grounded here, and the kind of people that they attract to the kind of activities or whatever the product they're selling here are the kind of people who actually appreciate the culture or the added value of such a historic site is. And I think for me, I think there is a diverse value that is not defined by professionals like me who have to study the history. And so this is an example that I really like, where this place-making approach of contemporary use in the historic site. And then I'm going to talk about traditional village because, as in previous introduction, one of my own personal research is in Guizhou in the ethnic minority villages. And then so a large part, there's a lot of problem about rural heritage. But the biggest part of this, which as opposed to modern architecture and urban conservation, it's a very strange concept where we're not taking a few historic buildings in a village, in a settlement, and recognize as heritage. We try to take an entire village with people living in it, with entire lifestyle and landscape and an eco-environment, and now we are calling it a heritage site. So this has never really happened before. And then I am trained as an architect. I am not built to deal with people and their lifestyle and their livelihood. So how do we deal with this? And obviously when you touch about lifestyle, you talk about modern living needs, you talk about development in China, you cannot avoid tourism. So this is actually becoming a very challenging heritage or thinking about conservation and interpretation or management on a very different scale. In fact, can you call conservation, can you call management when it's somebody's home? And this is, it poses a lot of, I would think, heritage related, but beyond heritage issues and skill set and knowledge. So, just going back in the China principle, when they talk about this, they talk about sites like this, historic cities, towns, villages, is they think that in terms of interpretation and use, they should retain historic function. Again, what does that mean? Basically, they talk about traditional way of life, but then what if you can't continue to function, or what if that function and traditional way of life also gets in the way of conservation, interpreting then, or development? So it raises all kinds of interesting questions. So this village, Dali village in Guizhou, is a Dong ethnic minority village. Is where I've worked on my PhD as well, and then I continue to work on projects there. So I've been there for 12, 13 years now. I'm showing a very pretty picture of it because it is very pretty. So one of the things that happen to pretty villages is that you are really slated for tourism development. This is what's going to happen in China. You can't avoid that. And it actually really took off during COVID because domestic tourism just really grew. And so we're dealing with a lot of problems there. But also, on the other hand, this is a very much living village. This is not one of those vacant Kongxingcun village. People are still very much living in there. Their traditional structure, their traditional economic structure, and their kind of social structure is still pretty much intact. They still rely on this kind of family blood relation structure to really support all kinds of economic and production activity in the village. So what does that really mean? And then also, I was asked to produce interpretation plan for this place, a 展示利用 plan, which for me, I really don't know how to display somebody's life, to be honest. So what we're talking about is then we start to think about, well, we have to approach it from a whole. First of all, we cannot avoid talking about the people. What does the people mean? What does the community mean? How do we interpret or present and at least make people understand the people's role and significance in this place? And obviously, the easy part was the physical fabric, the material. And then really, how do you make people understand their lives and their past lives, the tradition that they inherit, and also what their contemporary life is and what their life will mean in the future. So it is really using this approach where we have to think about how do we put all these things together when we talk about, I'm not going to build a museum there to show you how the Dong people live, but how do you come to the village and you can understand and what it means for them. And then one of the things that really I started focus on, not that it's really interpretation related, but I would say more use related, is we started this textile co-op for the women, where one of my biggest thing why I did that is because when I was focusing on the physical fabric of the architecture, that's when I realized the woman has no say in any of this issue, just because of the way the society has been structured. And I really want to engage the women not to talk about heritage, because a lot of them actually has only maybe an elementary education. A lot of them are illiterate. They can speak some Mandarin, but they don't read and write Mandarin, because also the Dong language, it's not a written language, it's only a spoken language. So I can't go to them and say, let me talk to you about heritage value. But I want them to start thinking about traditions and culture and how they are part of this, because they are the one who will educate the children. So we really approach textile because we realize this is something that is passed down from mother to daughter, from generation of women, and it's something that, without talking about the word of heritage and preservation, they understand what it means to continue something that's older than them. That's a tradition, there's a bond there, and this is something that is very personal to them as well. So we approach them with textile, and then we actually work with designers. I'm not going to go into detail because of the time constraint, but for those of you who are interested, I can share links and you can look it up on the website. This is really how we engage them to think about what their life means, because a lot of them do not read and write, and they don't speak very eloquently. So when they make textile, a lot of the time is how they interpret their life, is how they interpret the cosmology, they interpret nature, they interpret mythology that's been taught to them before. Because it's very hard for us to get those from the women. We can talk to the men, they can tell us it's a story that our father has told us, but it was very hard for us to get all this story and narrative from the woman verbally through words. And we realized this is a way to approach this material approach that's beyond words, but then it translates a lot of their thoughts and how they will interpret as what we talk about heritage. Obviously, it brings certain kind of, there's a use of it. So we bring designer, there are products that's being sold. So this is a collaboration we have with the company at Columbia Circle that I talked about earlier. We also try to bring in the architecture aspect, but not from conservation. It's actually we work with the carpenters locally and also working with designers. So we use a complete, only by the villagers, only by locally sourced material in the traditional trando structure, but a complete new design of a new structure to build a studio for the women, for the textile, for them to work on. Because we also think about what does it mean if they can't build their own traditional houses anymore, if they lost that skill set or they understand the contemporary value, that's when people are going to start building in concrete. That's when people are going to start building in materials and forms that are more convenient. So we also want to really explore kind of the potential of the use of traditional knowledge, not so much a traditional fabric, but traditional knowledge, and how do we translate the value in there. So this is the space that we have built and worked with local carpenters of the women. So the project has also been disseminated in a lot of different channels. So this is another Chinese fashion brand, JMBY, who has come and done this documentary talking about in this village how the women actually use cloth or textile to really convey their thoughts and their lifestyle and what it means for the cycle of the woman. This is the collaboration that we have with Naze, which is the brand that was actually at Columbia Circle. So we have done several events there, and we have invited the women as well, the craft women from Dali, to be participating at Columbia Circle as well, which is a very interesting experience where rural Guizhou meets Shanghai. So it's really me trying to, this is the fabric that we collaborated with by the women, collaborated with Naze, was selected by Dion as a part of their classic collection for the Vogue 130th anniversary. So it's really, we're trying to talk about here as in the translation of the value here and then how we use the power of traditional knowledge is really kind of beyond how we normally think of heritage, especially heritage in terms of the fabric. I can't bring a historic house built in Trando style stone architecture to you, but we can translate this power in other sense to disseminate where people can understand that these are people who still have a lifestyle that's continuing and it's going to continue to develop and evolve. So what does it mean for them to really present what their life means in this contemporary sense? You can't cut them away from this contemporary lifestyle. So this is really kind of our attempt and translation. I don't know if it's right. I don't know if it's appropriate. There's a lot of ethic challenges that we have on when you start to innovate traditions, when we start to innovate and try to talk about innovations and changes in heritage. But this is the sense that me and my partners, who are mostly designers, is we really want to harvest on the power and value of tradition and see where it goes. And this is the village now where this because of the new building that we have built, now there's a lot of new guest houses that's been developed and built in similar kind of modern contemporary vernacular style. So there are changes that's being introduced. And part of it, I would say, is probably from the attempt that we have tried. I don't know if it's a good or bad way of attempt on interpretation and use, but this is something that we feel that we can't have this very stagnant approach as we do at Palace Museum, 原状陈列. We can't do that. So this is something that I'm very much open for discussion and criticism.
Here in Hong Kong, the city and the society is grappling with these same kinds of issues and how to incorporate archaeological sites into the urban development planning scenario, and what role are they going to play, and how are we going to turn them into engines for development, and where does interpretation come in all of this? I'm wondering, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot, Julie. Could you just say a few words about the project you're working on and how you're kind of dealing with some of this? You can introduce yourself too, but although I think everybody in the room must know you.
The idea of identity in Hong Kong, like we've now become part of a much bigger territory. And so the project that actually Ryan's here as well, we're working on is in Kowloon Bay. It's the last walled village that we're excavating, and it will be part of a residential development, but at the same time also a conservation park. And so it's in an urban setting. We have a very close proximity to our heritage, and it's archaeology, but a little bit easier to interpret because we have structural remains. And so, hopefully the interpretation, which, Ryan will work on, will bring the two together, the urban and the new and the old. And so it's very exciting that Hong Kong is moving forward with this. It's not just Chinwai, sorry, I might be saying that wrong, yeah. But there's also the Lungzhong Bridge, stone bridge, which is being preserved and displayed. And so archaeology is definitely on the up and up in Hong Kong too, so happy to say.
Could you say a little bit, Julie, about some of the shall we say, the difficulties, the points of conflict, or the points of conflict is maybe not the right word, but how to sort out the differing interests between the developers developing the site and the context of the heritage interpretation, and how that all plays out. Huh?
So it's a small walled village, and the project is actually a public-private participation. And so we do have a private developer and the government working together on this and trying to, create, sort of a platform where both can live together. And so it also has a living heritage aspect to it, where the community does use this village. There's a Tin Hau temple, there's festivals that are attached to this village. So all these things will be able to continue once the development is up. And so there's a close relationship, and also in design of the residential development and what will go on display of the walled village. So, yeah. It should be a very nice project once it's finished.
I'm
I think,
excited to see it. Sorry.
No. Just lastly, I wanted to say that if not for development, I mean, we wouldn't be able to do this archaeological excavations here in Hong Kong. I mean, the territory is small, and there's very little academic research. So it's finding that balance.
I want to thank you for that, because I just want to address, because one of the 2 points I've been trying to avoid that you brought up, I think is still very important I should address, because first we talk about identity. One of the challenges we have for archaeological sites, because a lot of this is so far away, is that all those heritage sites presented, the community, as in the people who live within or around it, has the least connections and self-identity, identifying with an archaeological site that exists 3,000 years ago, for instance. And I have a colleague who actually was invited to do a research project on all the rural villages, community around Liangzhu, just to understand their connection, which very, very thin, not very strong. And that was the big problem, is how do local people, local community who live within and around the site, they don't connect, they don't identify with it. So that was one of the big issue with archaeological sites like that, especially when it's so large. So how do you justify its so a lot of it is emphasizing its economic benefits, because Wanke was also involved in the real estate development around Liangzhu. They developed a Liangzhu village, which is kind of an artistic hub. And the where the Liangzhu Museum is right now, the Southern Museum, that's also some development where Wanke has built. So there's definitely economic benefit. But one thing that we also discuss is we have avoided a lot on talking about social well-being and what is a social benefit to local community who are in there. And this is a very thorny question with all these archaeological site development in China. It's really that economic impact has been focused on so much that we really don't know how to deal with that social part.